Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ray, and welcome to the Wenderlich.com podcast. In this podcast, we'll keep you up to date with the latest app development tech talk. Now, here are your hosts, Dru Freeman and Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Ray. This is the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome to episode 9 for season 9. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 10th of July, 2019, for broadcast on the 7th of August, 2019. This episode, along with everything else this season, is sponsored by TripleByte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E. I am Dru Freeman, here with my indescribable season 9 co-host, Jenn Bailey.
Thanks, Dru. On this episode, we have the honor of talking with Romain. I've personally got to see his talks at both Google I/O and the 360 ANDEV conference here in Denver, Colorado. He's the manager lead of the Android Toolkit team at Google, which is the team that's responsible for the Android UI Toolkit Jetpack, a collection of tools designed to help developers build mobile applications faster. Prior to this, he was the lead for the Android graphics team and has worked on Android since before its first public release. Romain's work can still be found in your phones and SDKs today. He also knows a lot about color, displays, and too many things to mention in a 40-minute podcast.
Yeah, it's a good thing that this has also got a YouTube associated with it, which will have all the extra information that we don't fit into the 40-minute podcast. In this episode, Romain will discuss what is new in Android Q, which just released today as of this broadcast, as of the broadcast recording, and he's going to talk about some of his AR work. Later on in the show, in the second half, Jen's going to talk about her first experiences with Jetpack Composer, and hopefully maybe she'll get a couple of tips and secrets from Romain about the new Android UI framework. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So,
good to be here.
Obviously, I have to ask you the most important question about all of your experience. I'm told you do photography.
Yes, it's a hobby of mine that takes a little too much of my time sometimes.
Are those some of your photographs behind?
Behind, you see, yes, one of them.
So you'll have to watch the YouTube version of this to see the pictures behind him.
Yes, but if you have a Chromecast or if you have been using Android for a long time, you've probably seen some of my photos as wallpapers or backgrounds. Or if you use Gmail themes, some of those photos are photos I took.
That is amazing.
I have seen your photos in all of those places.
So let's get on to Android Q. It released today. This was beta number 5. Is that correct?
Yes. So I wouldn't say it has released. We just made available the 5th beta version to users who opt into the program.
What are the most exciting things, in your opinion, about the Android Q and beta 5 release in particular?
There are a number of features. One of my favorite ones, and I think a lot of our users and developers will agree, is the dark mode that's coming to the UI. So you can turn, by default, a lot of applications on Android and the system UI have this light theme that some people can find too bright in dark environments. So now you can turn everything dark. So applications, of course, can support the dark mode, and we have a system. It's an opt-in. Applications can ask for an auto dark mode where we try to intelligently turn the application dark.
Great. That was a question that I had is, what are some tips for developers who need to now change their apps from being a light theme to a dark theme?
So we have a lot of materials out there. In particular, at Google I/O, there were a couple talks on this topic. I believe it was Chris Baines and Nick Butcher. So they take you through all the styles and themes. What are the best practices to create, a successful dark theme for your application?
Yeah, and are there any specific design considerations with the dark modes? Like, I remember someone mentioned that photos can look bad under one of the default themes if you don't exclude them, if you just have it automatically flip from light to dark.
So the auto dark feature that we have tries to be smart and is rather conservative. So when something is considered very colorful, it's not going to try to turn it into something dark. So precisely to avoid this kind of issues. No, I mean, the main concern is the usual, making sure that things stay legible, that you have the right contrast, especially for accessibility, which is always very important to us. So yeah, another interesting feature we have is it's kind of a small feature, as in, it's not very obvious in the UI, but we have this live caption feature. So when you're watching a video, we use machine learning effectively to automatically create captions on screen, so it can work with any content, which is very useful when either you have trouble hearing or you don't want to turn on the sound, which might be situations where that's what you want.
I remember seeing that in one of the talks, and it looked really, really cool.
Now, is that captioning being done on device, or is that being done via network?
I believe it's done on device. And that is, another one of the themes of Android Q is around privacy. So the ability to do things like apply machine learning on device is very important, because that way the data doesn't leave your device and everything stays where it should be.
One of the things I remember from the Google I/O announcements, and I don't know if this is a part of Q or not, was the fact that they were trying to open up the machine learning so that you could actually see some of the process going on in the black box.
Not sure. What do you mean by that?
Well, where a lot of the computations occur inside, and you don't necessarily know what computations are being biased or favored or which ones are being used, that something was announced that they were going to try to open that up so that you can get a better feel for what decisions are being made in that process.
Right. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, unfortunately. Like I've been on Android for 12 years now, and I used to know everything about the system. But now, and which I think is a good thing for users, we have so many features, so many applications that it's hard to keep track of everything.
Yeah, I remember when the biggest news was stuff like Recycler View, and you could almost keep tabs on all the different modern topics. And nowadays, there's a lot to choose from. I've seen a lot of talk about Camera X, and I don't know a whole lot about cameras, but I would love to hear.
Yeah, so the thinking behind Camera X is it kind of relates to this bigger project we have called Jetpack, which is effectively a suite of libraries that we offer to make developing applications easier, and in different ways. Like, it started as a very simple what we used to call the support library, which was a way to target multiple versions of Android in a simpler way for developers. And it has grown to go quite beyond that. So now it's about the architecture of your application, how to do proper navigation. It's our way for us to have opinions on how applications should be built. And the idea of Camera X is more about compatibility as well as ease of use. It's a simplified camera API that does work around some of the issues across multiple versions of Android or across multiple devices. So if you want to use, the camera APIs in your application, you should probably start with Camera X.
That is really cool. I also noticed some of the new features were gestural navigation. Does that change how you develop a UI?
So it does imply a few changes, and there again, like, Jetpack is here to help you a little bit. We're making changes, for instance, to the drawer layout. It's that component when you slide from the left of the screen. Because the new gesture navigation lets you, basically, the back button is not there anymore when you use gesture navigation, so you have to swipe from the edge of the screen. Which could interfere with what the application is doing. So applications need to participate a little bit in the process to make sure that the system and the applications don't fight. And again, typically the navigation drawer, you would swipe from the edge of the screen to show the drawer, but now it goes back. So we have APIs in place to make that work.
Are there overrides in case you're running some kind of game and you actually need that area?
Yeah, there are various things you can do, and again, for developers who are interested in all the nitty-gritty details, there were talks at Google I/O specifically on this topic, on what are the best practices and where you should put the content, how you should handle the gestures, and what APIs you can use to do it successfully.
Mm-hmm.
Great. One thing I'm curious about is the folding devices. That probably poses some challenges for developers in how they design their UI.
Yeah, so what we have is the emulator now supports the foldable format. so you can test, inside the emulator. And we do have APIs in Android Q to help you this with foldables. I have not done anything myself related to foldables, so I don't know what the guidelines are or what is proper UX. But Android as a platform tries to support like the entire ecosystem. So this is something we're bringing to the platform itself.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask you, I know some people are very strong with UI design. When I started programming, I think a lot of people I've taught, I'm a community college teacher, think like, oh, well, I'm going to learn about UI design because that seems artistic and like it's going to be easier than some of the code. And then I found out pretty quickly that for me, it was a lot easier to write some of the more hard, involved code than it is to make something look good or to make something feel usable. So I really admire people who have a talent to lay out a good UI. What makes a good UI? What goes into a good design?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very broad question, and I agree with you. Like UI design obviously is a skill, and within UI design, there are different areas, right? Like there's interaction design, there's motion design, there's just the ability to be able to draw pretty pixels, and those are not. Sometimes they're the same person, and it's great that there are people who are good at all of these things. And sometimes those are actual different persons with different jobs. I think nowadays, because we have those computers in our pocket and we tend to go through a lot of applications, it's really about having a UI that's easy to grasp, that you can learn quickly without any form of onboarding, without falling into the trap of being simplistic. Building, I think what the hardest thing to build is a simple UI, which means it's something that empowers you as a user, that almost can grow with you as you get accustomed to the application, whereas simplistic UI is just something that's going to remove all the features and all the things that make the app enjoyable, just because that way the first time it seems intuitive. And the best designers I've worked with, they manage to give you those extremely powerful apps, and you just, as you use the app, you just learn more and more without even realizing it, and it's always quite amazing to see that. And it's true on all platforms, right? Like it's not specific to Android.
Yeah, I like that, the idea that if you have your initial UI being simple, but without it actually detracting away from either the usage or from the fact that there are more UI elements to learn later on once you become more efficient. I like that phrase that the app grows with you. I think that's a very powerful concept. We also had Erica Sadoun on earlier in the season where she talked about the perfect time frame for a mobile app is one trip to the restroom.
Yes, pretty much. And it's also interesting that, at least as far as I'm concerned, like the apps I love the most are apps that let me do the tasks I've set out to do, like in the fastest way possible. My goal in life, I do software and I love software, but I don't want to use software if I don't have to use it. Staying in an app for the sake of staying in the app is not interesting to me as a user. I just want to get things done. I want software to get out of the way.
I've heard the design principle that an app should do one thing and one thing well. And I really like what you said, that it's hard to build a simple UI.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it also really depends, I believe, on your audience, right? Obviously, productivity applications that are aimed at professionals can't be limited to doing only one thing, because there's a demand there for something more powerful, and you can still, and it becomes that much harder to keep the application simple. To me, a really good example of that is there's this suite of applications on macOS called and Windows actually also called Affinity. So they have Affinity Designer, Photo, and Publisher. They're more or less equivalent to, like, for instance, Photoshop, and they're very approachable. They're fairly simple. But when you dig a little bit, like, they are incredibly powerful, and they also work with one another. So when you have all of them installed, like they just complement each other, which is kind of neat. And they're, by all means, like, they do more than one thing, but they're not scary when you launch them.
I hope so. I'm about to release an app that does 6 different things. It's like it's a utility bucket, so it's got 6 little utilities in it, and each one of them actually has to do their one thing fairly well. So we'll pray that it's not one thing.
But yeah, and and UX is also these days, like we think, material design or like touch UIs, but UX is not always about just pretty pixels that you touch on screen. Like a best example, like to what you were saying of apps that do one thing and one thing well, is simply the Unix command line tools. It's like very targeted tools that do just one thing, but you can easily compose them together, and that's your UX to build yourself like a more complex task.
But can you say they really do one thing when you find out they have at least 700 minus commands with them?
So it really depends on the tool. Yes, a lot of them do just one thing.
Like the command git or the command Python, they do a little bit more than just.
Git is a special case. I really like Git, but the UX of Git is a very interesting use case.
Git's one of the few apps that I've seen that the UX that has been wrapped around it for graphic interfaces does a very good job of translating a whole lot of commands into a good UI experience. Now, I know without a doubt, there are a lot of people who will argue with me and say, no, you've got to stick to the command line. but I found that a lot of the people who have wrapped Git into a UI have done really good jobs with it.
Yeah, I agree. I use Git both from the command line and from UIs. Sometimes it's just easier that way. Like I said, I want to be able to get my job done as fast as possible. So if it's a UI, then so be it.
So do you have any recommendations for taking your UI skills up a notch?
I mean, one of the so there are actually very interesting books out there. I wish they're somewhere behind me, actually. And what I found interesting is that some of the fundamental design principles haven't changed in a long time. So obviously, they take a different shape, they take a different form because we just have different form factors today. But one of my favorite books on the topic of UI design was about open looks, which was a UI toolkit, I think by Sun Macrosystems for Spark stations at the end of the 80s, like early 90s. And the book is fascinating because they show what went into the design of that UI toolkit. But it was in black and white. They didn't have color displays just yet. And it's great to see like how they worry about readability, ease of use, even when all you have to work with is black and white. And there are other books, one of the most famous one, like The Design of Everyday Things. It's not about software, right? It's just about everything that surrounds us. And even there, like you can find like terrible designs, and you can find also beautiful designs. I'm sure we've all found a door. Like sometimes you try to open it, it takes you a couple of seconds to figure out like, do I have to pull, do I have to twist, do I have to push? And it's also great, like to think about those things because they don't translate directly to UX, but it's a way like to train yourself to think about usability more than just like colors and animations and the fancy things that you put on screen. And some of the best UIs I've used in the past, they were not necessarily pretty as well. So when we talk UI design, we often conflate like usability and attractiveness kind of the design, and both are very important. But first and foremost, your app should again empower the user, like be easy to use, easy to understand, is it accessible? Does it work in multiple languages? And I remember reading stories about like old school applications that were written for MS-DOS, where you have this horrible like blue and white screens, like all in ASCII art, and then people transitioned to like real GUIs. But they missed the old ones because the old ones were optimized for the job. So for instance, data entry, and they were all driven by keyboard and a few keystrokes, and they lost that in the transition. And so they didn't care about having fancier graphics. They wanted to get the job done quickly. And again, it depends. Some apps will benefit more from having fancy visuals. Some apps won't. But yeah, I really encourage to don't necessarily just look at the new principles or just what goes in material design, for instance. That's important, but also look back and look at what people have done before in the past, because there's a lot to learn from them.
Let's see.
And we have at Google at other conferences, there's a lot of talks on design, and there's tons of resources today, like much more than 15 or 20 years ago.
Oh yeah, and it's amazing that it's a field that's always changing, but at the same rate is always based in very similar mentality. So obviously, I have to ask you: do you lean toward or away from skeuomorphism?
Both, actually.
Best answer.
Yes. One of the reasons that part of my work and one of the things I like to do these days is to work on 3D real-time physically based rendering engines, where you basically try to recreate the world, photorealistically. So there's no more. It doesn't get more skeuomorphic than this. At the same time, I am kind of glad I've gone through the craze of skeuomorphism, especially on macOS for when was it? Like when I had one of my PowerBook where every window was made of titanium or like brushed wood, and I have built UIs myself that were like this. Yeah, it's good that we went away from it. Part of me can't help but wonder. Our industry is full of cycles. We're seeing that nowadays, for instance, with functional programming that becomes it's becoming mainstream again, and functional programming is nothing new. And I wonder if, in 10, 15 years from now, everybody will, go back to skeuomorphism and say, no, this is way better because, it reminds us of the physical world and it's more intuitive. So we'll see. We'll see.
I'm curious because, as we mentioned, we also want to talk about some of your AR work. And in an AR world, all of a sudden, we're now merging the computer with the real world. And for me, that seems to have skeuomorphism written all over it, that you want to be able to have things that you can touch that fit into that real world.
Yeah, it's kind of a mix of both, actually. It's interesting. If you look at the Google Maps AR navigation, they have a very flat design in AR. So they show you, directions. So you have big arrows that appear in the real world. They didn't try to make those arrows look like the real world. And part of it is, I assume you kind of want that to make sure you understand that this is not part of your actual environment. It's added information. At the same time, if you're using AR to do shopping, for instance, and you want to see how that couch would look like in your living room, you definitely want that couch to look as realistic as possible. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting mix of both, which is why it's kind of an interesting field. And I gotta say, yeah, the non-realistic, the non-skeuomorphic design is a lot more difficult it's a lot easier to implement than the skeuomorphic one.
Mm-hmm. So with AR, we're currently in what can only be described as the three-handed world, because you need two hands on your device to hold it and the third hand to actually point to the world that you're looking at through your device. Do you think that we're going to see something re-enter the consumer level? Do you think a Google Glass can succeed or?
Yeah, honestly, it's hard to say for me. What I think is interesting is I'm seeing a lot of applications of AR where AR tries to be the experience. And what I find, and sometimes that is the case. It's great to see. I don't know, in the shopping app again, you can see the objects, how they would look like. But I think, thinking about AR as a feature of your application is much more powerful. Because again, it's not about, the technology or tool being the end goal. It's just that it's a tool. It's a way to give the user what they need, to help them get to do what they need done. And to me, AR is just one more arrow that we have at our disposal, in our quiver. And that's probably a shift. It's the early days of AR, so there's a lot of excitement, and I think it's going to take a little bit before we see that shift entirely.
So
I was blown away. Oh, sorry, Dru. I was blown away by that AR map experience at I/O. That was incredible. And so.
And that's a good example of what I just said, where Google Maps is not AR-centric. You can see the direction in 2D, they have the 3D navigation, and they have an AR mode. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, they give you the different tools you need, and one of them happens to be AR because that's the right tool.
I see a lot of people, as you mentioned, trying to make AR the app. And as a result, they're getting very close into crossing into almost VR with the AR, in that they're trying to create the world that the AR is now no longer complementing, but is becoming the major detractor from.
Right. Yeah, and in AR, like the key term I think is augmented reality, right? You're not trying to replace the environment; you're just trying to add to it in a meaningful way. And I assume like we're just seeing the beginnings, and a few years from now we'll have a lot of more exciting stuff on our phones.
Now, I'm not saying I wouldn't mind somebody like what's the companies that are doing VR, the Vive, for example, having some kind of cameras on the outside to sort of shift you progressively from an AR into a VR for a game.
Right.
I think that would just be a lot of fun, and patent pending me.
Oh my goodness. I have too active of an imagination for VR games. They had to catch me at, it was 360 and Div. I was running away from the dinosaur. The guys at the demo were ready for that. Apparently it happens all day.
That's interesting. It's really because as a graphics programmer, like when I'm in VR, I do enjoy it, but my brain automatically switches to, I can see a triangle here. I wonder how that shader works there. So like, it doesn't work on me as well as it should.
That's funny.
That goes back to me when I was a kid playing Asteroids. Now remember, I'm older, so Asteroids was my kid game, and I remember even as a kid I'd play Asteroids and I'd be sitting there going, so where is the intersection when I actually hit them? What's the collision point? And a kid is not supposed to be thinking about collision points. He's supposed to be going shoot the little damn blocks.
Yeah, it's annoying when your work or your passions get in the way of your enjoyment sometimes.
Does the photography do that too?
Photography, yes and no. It does. It's sometimes when I'm traveling or trying to enjoy my time with family, for instance, and decide to leave my camera behind. Of course, it's that one time where you have this beautiful light and you see this perfect scenery. You're like, oh damn, I wish I had my camera with me. And of course, when I have my camera, I don't get the right. And then I'm like, why did I carry that entire backpack with me all day for no reason?
Oh no. It reminds me of a graphic designer once told me that once you're a graphic designer, you can't look at logos without mentally critiquing them. And I can't imagine doing that in the VR world.
Indeed, it must be tough to be a designer for a living.
Yeah. My undergraduate training, as I mentioned on the show, is in theater production and direction.
That sounds amazing.
And I've done television production and direction as well. And there are times that a movie can be ruined for me because I'm taken out from my training on the specifics that go underneath the hood.
Oh, interesting. So it's more like, you notice what they've done wrong, or that...
Either when they've done something wrong or they've done something really, really well, but it just is done too well. And I'm like, how did they do that? I'm taken out of that moment. It's like somebody who does magic going to a magic show,
That happens to me a little bit in some movies too, where when the photography of the movie is beautiful, or a freeze frame of the movie could be a photograph. That's also my reaction. I stop looking at the story or listening to the actors. I'm like, oh, that's beautiful framing and the colors are great. Anyway.
Oh, don't shy away from it. Between photography and theater, I know we both deal with the term mise en scène.
Yes, exactly.
We'll put that in the show notes because I don't remember how to spell it. So what kind of AR stuff are you currently working on then?
So I, or at least part of my team works on the rendering engine that is used in a library called Synform, provided by Google. And Synform is a library that talks with ARCore. So ARCore is our AR tracking library, if you will. So it detects planes in the world. You can position anchors in 3D space, and it will make sure that it will tell your application, like as you move around, as the user moves around, it will tell you where they are in the virtual world. And SceneForm goes on top of that, and SceneForm lets you easily load 3D objects with textures and materials and position them, and it will automatically talk to ARCore and do all the heavy lifting. And so my team has been working on just the rendering engine for that framework. So like I said, it was about building this photorealistic, or what we call physically based rendering engine, which again, I drive my wife crazy sometimes because I'm at home and suddenly I stop like to look, like the granite on the countertop, or I was taking the pictures of the Christmas ornaments because they were showcasing an effect of light that could be the reference in the engine. So yeah, it twists your brain a little bit. But it's very enjoyable, and you get to learn a lot about how in a superficial way, of course, but how the real world works and how light works, and it's very interesting. And you realize that despite all our advances and how amazing the current games look or the current movies look, we are so far from being able to recreate the world the way it is.
No Ready Player One just yet.
No, we are not there.
My son asked. My son is just verging on 13, and he wants to know if we can create Ready Player One. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, you might be able to in your time. I don't know."
Maybe also about that. The way I like to put it is, what we do in those rendering engine is what I call graphics mathematics. If it looks right, it is right. But if a mathematician looked at what we're doing, they would have a heart attack.
In this episode, we've been talking to Romain about the new features of Android Q and AR. After this message from our sponsor, TripleByte, we'll be back for the second half. And
that's when we'll get a chance to listen to you talk about Jetpack Compose.
Yes.
I will try, yes.
All right. We'll be back right after this. This RayWenderlich.com podcast is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on phone screens, take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your interest or your cover letters. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you get to go straight to the final interviews with the companies on their platform. It's like the common app for software engineers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. And I can appreciate that. Being in the industry for 35 years, I'm entirely self-taught. My undergraduate study was in theater, and I left school to do my first job, so I don't carry a bachelor's, no bachelor's of arts, no bachelor's of science, and that's the one thing I'm often trying to hide or misdirect on my resume. With TripleByte, they'd care more about the coding experience that I have and not worry about that one little fact. Apply now at triplebyte.com/Ray. That's triplebyte.com, byte, BYTE, as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus. And a special thanks to TripleByte for sponsoring this episode of the Ray Wenderlich podcast. Welcome back to section 2. We got Jen, who has been experimenting with Jetpack Compose, and we're going to find out how well or how not so well that went today. Jen, first of all, because remember, I'm the cheap iOS person in the group, can you give me a quick lowdown on what Jetpack Compose is?
All right. So Jetpack Compose is an unbundled toolkit. It's designed to simplify UI development. And I think the parallel you could draw from the iOS world would be Swift UI, or it looks a lot like Flutter or React.
Okay.
So it's a declarative tool because it uses tags and markup. And it's reactive because the UI will update to reflect the data model automatically. And that was one question I had for Romain is, what is the difference between a reactive programming model and data binding?
They are very similar. The main difference that in the reactive programming model, at least our version of the reactive programming model, is that we want the data flow to be one way. So data always flows from top to bottom, and what goes back from bottom to top are the events. So one of the reasons we are building Jetpack Compose is because our existing UI toolkit, which has served us and still serves us really well over the past 10 years, and has gone through major improvements. A huge source of bugs comes from the fact that we don't have this one way for the flow of data. So a typical example is, let's say you have a slider and the user moves the slider and you want to filter or change the value. So when the user moves the slider, the application receives a callback. And inside that callback, you can say, no, I want the value to be this other value instead. But by setting the value, you're going to trigger another callback back to the application. And that can lead to complex code that is tricky to maintain and to test. And beyond that, one of the issues as well is that there's no single source of truth for the data inside the application, because the data itself has a data model that's usually related to your business logic. So that's basically whatever you want it to be. But then the widgets themselves have a data model. And basically, all the code that you're writing as a developer is kind of glue to make sure that those two data models stay in sync. And so you often have a lot of bugs that come from the fact that you are desynchronized somehow, somewhere. And Jetpack Compose effectively tries to fix this issue. And it's also, under the umbrella of Jetpack, so it's what I said in part one, that we try to make it easier to write applications. And so we've went through a lot of iterations internally before we talked about Jetpack Compose publicly, where we kept trying to simplify the APIs and simplify them more and more and more. And for instance, we started with a model where we had, like you mentioned, we had tags that looked like almost XML, similar angle brackets. We decided against that because, in the spirit of simplification, it was let's not add something that's not already in the language. So now our widgets, our components, they look like functions. And same thing. At first, we had classes to create our widgets, which is something pretty natural in UI toolkits. But then we realized that when you want to create a widget, there's all that ceremony involved, where you have to create a class, you have to extend something, you have to extend the right thing, you have to implement, a constructor, a specific method. And if you get it wrong, then you're going to have compile time issues or runtime issues. So we wanted to get rid of all that. And now a widget is just a function. And so again, the goal is to simplify as much as possible. And another important pillar behind Compose is the Android UI toolkit. When it started, one of the ideas was to make it super easy to build Android applications. And one way we've done that was to give you a lot of fairly complex components out of the box that will do a lot for you, which was great because you could build hey, here's my list of contacts in a few lines of code. The problem is it makes for components that are fairly rigid, that are difficult to customize, and that over the years, it forces you to add more and more features to those very complex components. And that makes the API harder to use over time for developers. And even worse, when the component doesn't do quite exactly what you want, you can't really fix it, or you can't really rewrite it yourself. I have a lot of developers who came to me and they want to do something with our text component. And, my answer sometimes is unfortunately, well, you can't do that because our component was not meant to do this. So here, copy paste the thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code. Here's a white paper on text layout, and good luck. You're on your own now. And that's not a good answer. That's never a good answer, right? This was getting in the way of people building their applications. They want to worry about their features, not about the framework. It's getting in the way of good UI design because sometimes you have to say no to UI designers for the wrong reason, which is, oh, the widget was not meant to do this, so we cannot do it. So instead, the approach we're taking with Compose, and it's in the name, we want to let you compose widgets out of smaller widgets. So we're doing a lot more, it's kind of back to what we're saying about apps. It's a lot more of targeted widgets that can do one thing, but they do it really well. And they're all public and you can reuse them. And if you don't like our checkbox and you want to recreate your own, it's only a few lines of code. There's no magic in our checkbox. We only use things that are available to you, as opposed to the existing UI toolkit where there's a lot of private stuff that you don't have access to. We have and the more we play with this, we're not ready yet to have a version 1, and we're still iterating on a number of concepts. But we are so far pretty pleased with how it feels when we use it. Like, especially for some of us who have been using the existing toolkit for so many years, very quickly was like, hey, this feels a lot better. So we think we're onto something good.
How's your experience going with it so far, Jen?
I have enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to when there's more documentation, because at this point, I'm just reverse engineering the samples. I'm intermediate with Kotlin at best, but I was able to, I got to attend your talk of what's new in Android and then your UI talk. So I got to hear you talk about it, and I was able to reproduce a sample similar to your joke counter.
Good, I'm glad.
And it worked for me, so I was able to set it up, and that was a new experience too. I love growing with Google, and I'm a fangirl because I'm a hobbyist developer alongside teaching. So I never had any experience with using the Android open source project or the repo tool, so that was really fun. The instructions were really clear. I was able to do that without a hitch to go download. It was a version of Android Studio. Yes. And I have to ask, because in the top right corner there, I noticed it said version 3.5. And so I don't know if it's public information or not, but will this be in the next version of Android Studio?
Probably not. I don't know when the next version of Android Studio is going to be, but so if we back out a little bit for the listeners who haven't followed Google I/O, Jetpack Compose right now it's not even an alpha. It's not even a technical preview. What we did at Google I/O was, if we back out a little more even, with Jetpack and some of the architectural components, we decided to be as open as possible with our developer community. So we developed a lot of those libraries in the open, going through long alpha and beta cycles to be able to gather as much feedback as possible. And unsurprisingly, it was good for everyone involved. And so we decided to do the same thing for Jetpack Compose. Like, once we felt that we had something that was structured enough to start, having discussions with the community, we decided to, we're not ready yet, and it's going to take a while, but we'd like to share the source code. We would like to move all the development in the open. So, you can watch daily all the changes we're making to Jetpack Compose, even every hour, you can see all the changes that are happening. So we're not hiding anything. And part of it is because we want the community to be involved, and we want the feedback, because, you, for instance, Jen, you write applications. I don't anymore, unfortunately. And so, I have tons of ideas, I have my own intuitions, but we want to hear from people who are out there, build the applications. We want to make what's hard for you, we want to make it easy. And the best way to know that is to ask you directly and to get you involved. And we have discussion channels. For instance, there's a Slack for Kotlin from JetBrains. So it's called Kotlin Lang, and there's a Compose channel on that Slack where a few people from the Jetpack Compose team are present every day. And so you can join and talk to us and give us feature requests, to tell us what you don't like about Compose, or ask us why we did things one way or another. So what we did at I/O was basically what you said. We put all the code in AOSP, and so we have instructions online on how you can download it. We on purpose did not provide it as a ready-to-use library, because we want people to understand that this is not ready for production. Please don't push applications in Play Store using this, because not meant for that. So we're basically asking you to download the source code and compile it, but we made it as easy as possible. And in particular, there's a special version of Studio that has support for Jetpack Compose enabled inside. And it's a script that you launch from the source tree, and you will launch that special version of Android Studio.
Now, we also have a primer on the Ray Wenderlich site. Is that correct, Jen?
That's correct. I got a little help from a primer on our site and also the documentation from Google. So
That's good.
we can put a link in the show notes to Joe's tutorial. So that's what we always do right after I.O., at least me and my friends is, oh, let's go try the new stuff. That looked about my speed. I'm like, this looks like something I can understand enough to play with.
That's awesome. Yeah, no.
Here. This isn't done yet, but we're going to show you how to use it, even though we don't even know how it's used.
But
I'll be the first.
Yes, but and it's important. It's also like seeing people try to explain how it works when it's new to them as well is also good for us, because the fact we've seen a number of articles, on Medium and blog posts of people who had like a very good grasp of the concepts and were able to explain it very clearly within days. And to us, to some level, it kind of vindicates what we've been doing, because if someone can grasp it so quickly and clearly explain it, one of the things we're afraid of is like it's a lot of new things to learn and understand. And, we run user studies and stuff like that, but we want to make sure that anybody can easily get up to speed. And one of the big changes, I think you touched upon that a little bit, is that it's all written in Kotlin. So at I.O., we said that Android is now Kotlin first. We're still supporting Java very much, but Compose is written in Kotlin. And one of the reasons that it enables us to do what we're doing, plus designing what we think are better APIs. So we know we're asking a lot from developers, but we're here to help them transition.
Is that this seems like Kotlin really lends itself well to this application because of the Lambda aspect of the language?
Exactly it. And especially the magic of the trailing lambdas. When the last parameter of a function is a lambda, you don't have to pass it as a parameter. You can just open the curly braces and put your code right there. And that's basically how Compose works. When you say, column, open curly brace, button, or open curly brace, you're just calling two functions called column and button, and they each take a lambda, and that's how you compose all the widgets together. So it works really well. And under the hood, the way Jetpack Compose works is actually fairly interesting. It's a plugin for the Kotlin compiler. So our composable functions, what we call the composable functions, the widgets, are treated a little bit differently than regular functions. They're more like the suspend functions that you find in coroutines. So we couldn't do that just as a library. We usually don't do this kind of trickery with compilers, but in that particular case, doing it at the compiler level enabled us to do something that's simpler and easier than the alternatives that we could think of.
And it'll be able to receive updates sooner. Did I understand that right?
Yeah. So one of the drawbacks, in some ways, it's also one of the strengths of the existing UI toolkit, is that it's part of the system. So we only deliver updates when the system is updated, which can lead to frustrating situations both for us and for external developers, where let's say if you file a bug and I fix it and I tell you, Jen, you're going to be super happy I fixed the bug. Your reaction will be like, great, the fix will be on the vast majority of devices in a few years. Until then, I don't care. And that is an issue. So Jetpack Compose is just a library that you put inside your application, which means you'll be able to take updates as often as you want, or as rarely as you want. Like if we do something you don't necessarily agree with, you can withhold and keep another version. I think you shouldn't. And it will also give us the opportunity, and we'll do that extremely rarely, I hope, but it could give us the opportunity to change the APIs, because we cannot change the APIs in the platform, because otherwise we would break applications and it would be bad. We want to keep applications running. But when it's a library that you take on inside your application, between major versions of the library, we could change the APIs based on feedback and to make your life that much easier. So yeah, we're very excited. We have a lot of work to do still.
I can't wait until there's more documentation, and I was having a lot of fun working it around in there. And once upon a time, I was a .NET programmer, and I actually found and fixed a bug in Visual Studio. So now with Android Open Source Project, I'm like, hey, maybe I'll Maybe I'll contribute a tiny little line of code someday.
You can, especially in Compose. I mean, yeah, all you have to do is send a patch, and we can do code review.
You never know, because if you spend enough time looking through code, you might find something. I did once.
Oh yeah.
And poor Dru, you're not like in the Apple realm. You don't have to deal with,
We have the
not all your users all update to the same version. So
well, we also have all of the Swift
world.
world.
So diverse.
we have the Swift world out there with the commenting area and the ability to put patches in and put Swift comments in. So, it's wonderful to see these core foundational things in both OSs in the public domain, because it allows the end user, the end developers who have to use these tools to really be able to say, this is a scalpel-like fix that we really need to make things work better.
Yeah, there's that, and also I've used open source platforms and frameworks a lot in my short career, and what I've always enjoyed is just sometimes even the best frameworks are going to run into bugs, you're going to run into documentation that's not perfect, and sometimes just being able to look at the source code helps understand things. Or it's not because it's a bug, looking at the code, you learn things, you understand the performance profile of the API you're using, so you become a better user of that library. It has a lot of benefits, and it goes both ways, right? People find issues that we didn't find, or they tell us about better ways of doing things. I really enjoy it.
What kind of things do you feel are currently still really lacking in Jetpack that needs to be fleshed out more?
In the existing libraries, I think we're in a very good shape. I mean, there's ongoing work on most of the libraries, and now Jetpack is pretty big. I don't remember the exact number, but we have about 70 libraries or something like this that span so many domains. The main issue we have, honestly, is that we have tons of ideas. It's just a question of resources. What should be our priorities? What libraries should we build first? Where can we have the most impact for our developers? It's always frustrating. We have all those discussions internally. It's maybe we'll do this next year. And
is that the same for Compose?
Compose a little less so, because it's fortunately a problem space that we know well, because the Android Toolkit team that now does the existing UI Toolkit, the Compose Toolkit, some 3D rendering, this compiler plugin for Kotlin, and all the Jetpack libraries that have nothing to do with UI, used to be the UI Toolkit team and was doing only UI. So some of us have spent 10 years building a UI Toolkit. And so we have a fairly good idea of the feature set, the hard problems, making sure that we do accessibility, keyboard navigation, this kind of stuff, making sure we support all the form factors that Android needs to support, because that includes autos and watches and tablets and phones. And so, we Compose, it's more a question of making sure we deliver. We want to deliver something as fast as we can. At the same time, we want to deliver something that's as good as possible. And it's optimizing for, we can't spend the next 10 years refining the APIs. But we also don't want to ship tomorrow and give you something that is not as good as it could be. So it's just finding that right balance between what's good and what's soon.
Is there anything in the Compose pipeline that you can tell us about that may be coming relatively soon?
Nothing major. Like I said, it's all open, so you can see the work that's ongoing, and we work at all the different levels. There's still a lot of work that we're doing on the compiler. It's both features and optimizations, integration inside the IDE. We're working actively on the tech stack, because what we showed at Go.io did not have the ability to edit text, so we're working on that. There's going to be integration with the existing view system. We're largely inspired by Kotlin. One of the things we love about Kotlin is if you have your Java project and you want to switch to Kotlin, you don't have to rewrite the entire app. You can just, your next file or your next class can be in Kotlin. So it makes it very easy to transition little by little. And with Compose, we're trying to take the same approach where you can take Compose UI widgets, put them in an existing Android UI, or take existing UI widgets from Android and put them inside the Compose tree. That way you won't have to redesign your entire application. Maybe it's like the next screen you write can be in Compose, or part of the next screen you write. And like I said, we really want to help people with the transition.
Jen, do you have any other questions with Compose?
Oh, sure. So one of the reasons why you guys were moving this direction, if I understood correctly, is it easier to maintain state? Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, and that's what I was saying earlier, where it's a prime of the source of truth. When it's when you have multiple sources of truth, who knows which one is the right one? And really, it's trying to solve this fundamental problem. And a lot of the architecture practices, not just specific to Android, but MVP, MVC, all those beautiful things. Part of what they're trying to solve is making sure there's a source of truth and the data gets propagated where it should be propagated. And by tackling this problem, at a fundamental level in the UI toolkit, we can greatly help, at least in one critical part of the application, which is the UI layer. And also, I'm sure you hopefully you got that feeling when you were trying Compose yourself, but the amount of code you write is a lot smaller, and it's more declarative. Like, it's more that you declare, you show how you want the UI to look like, not how it's going to look like that. And that's what matters. We want you to focus on what counts. That is, implement your features, make sure your app is delightful for your users, and don't worry too much about our APIs. They shouldn't be in the way.
One thing I really loved about it is how everything is now in one place. And one thing that I don't use a lot, but what I might miss, is the design view, because it was there's no more layout folder. And then in a way I'm like, yay, no more layout. And then in another way I'm like, there's nothing visual to see if these are in the right place.
It's funny because, earlier I was talking about the cycles in our industry, and I remember, 20 years ago or so, separating the UI and the code was very important. And now we're like, wait, no, let's put them back together. It's easier that way. So I expect that in 20 years, we'll go back the other way.
I kind of like having it in one place, because you mentioned in your talk, or I think it was another person, but in a talk you were in, that if you're in a distracted environment, you lose your place in your code.
Yeah, there's
so you have to follow 3 or 4 files to find everywhere it is.
And also over time, when you separate the UI from the code, there's always those situations where you need a bit of logic, right? You need to say, well, I want this button to show when I don't have data in my database. But if there's data, I want to show that list of components instead. And what's nice with the Compose approach, and like React Native, for instance, the same thing, is that by mixing the code and the declarative UI, that becomes completely natural. You use the language you already know. Because otherwise you end up with doing data binding in your XML layout files, which is bringing the code into the declarative UI layer where they should not be code, but we can't escape it. So we end up with this kind of like bastard model where we kind of like do both but badly. But yeah, so we think that's going to be right. And for the tools, like for the visual tools, tools are important to us. And if you thought like what we've been doing with constraint layout and motion layout, and we've invested deeply in visual design and trying to help developers who want visual tools. And this is something that we definitely keep in mind with Compose. We have tons of ideas of things we can do. Actually, I just had a very long meeting this morning with the tools team, this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's we want to do something in that space. We want to give you more than just like code on screen.
One of the nice things about having the code drive the UI now, and especially in a declarative sense, is being able to refactor out into smaller chunks or into smaller UI bits. So that really makes that concept of saying, if my state is this way, then here's an entire blob of UI to show. Or if it's another way, here's an entirely different blob of UI to show.
Yeah.
And it really lets you throw those around almost as easily as a delegate pattern.
That's a very good point. The other thing I like, and it's very silly, but because we just use Kotlin and functions, if the UI you're declaring starts to become a little big, You can select a few lines, say extract method, and now you've refactored your UI into like, two separate bits. It's just a function. So there's nothing magical about it. It's just functions everywhere, and you can use them just like use functions all the time.
I like how the words that have been used, the functions kind of emit the UI component. And
yeah, the comparison that Jim, who was one of the very early engineers on this project, used is the equivalent of, when you call print, like when you say print hello world, you effectively emit your UI, and it's kind of fire and forget. You're just saying like, hey, here's what I want to see on screen. Don't make me like, create a tree, add things myself. And so that's the same idea like in this reactive world. It's just to say, I just, if foo, I just want to see a button, else I just want to see this other thing. And somebody else will figure it out.
Yeah. So can we talk the Flutter team into using Kotlin?
That's a question for the Flutter team. And for Compose, we were obviously inspired by things like Flutter, as well as React and React Native. It was very interesting to see everything that had been done in the industry. And for us, it was recognizing that there were all those amazing ideas that had appeared in the past few years and say, what, we're going to do something that follows the same principles, but we can do something more integrated with our Kotlin language, with our tooling, and we're also trying to bring our own vision to it, which is trying to simplify as much as possible, only functions, for instance.
Yeah, and one last thing I can think of is, are you able to say at this point, will this replace the old UI like completely, or will it always just be you get to choose?
Well, if it will, probably not for a very, very, very long time. If only because the UI Toolkit, first of all, it works, which is kind of a nice feature to have. Also, it has not 100%, but it has millions of applications with millions of developers. We want to keep those happy and working. But the UI Toolkit is in the system, so we're not going to remove it from the system. And maybe someday there's no more app in the world that uses the existing UI Toolkit, maybe, but I don't see that happening. So right now, it's, for instance, at I/O we mentioned a new Jetpack library we're working on called view binding, which is kind of data binding, but much more limited in scope and targeted at solving the particular issue of finding views in your XML layout. And to us, that's one of the things we're doing. We also have View Pager too. So we're still investing in the existing UI Toolkit because there are applications shipping today, and we want to help developers who are doing that. So we're not abandoning them, definitely not. So it's I have this corny joke that we're called Android, not Ordroid. So we're doing both.
That's a good joke.
Now I thought Chet was the one who made the jokes and you're the one who assessed them.
Chet and I have known each other for 15 years or so now. I spent a lot of time with him. I guess I've inherited some of the bad aspects of Chet. And the good ones too.
Yeah, see, that's one of your talents. You're very good at knowing a good joke from a bad joke.
I'll tell you, it's not a bad joke right now, but declarative UI, this declarative reactive trend in UI really seems to be an amazing and powerful wave of the future. It's taking off not just on the Kotlin side, but I'd be remiss in saying that there's some very similar work going on in the Swift world.
Of course, yeah. And when you take a step back too, what's interesting is, and actually that's how we built Compose. The compiler and what we call the Compose runtime know nothing about Android UIs. We have what actually makes the UI part of Compose is what we call Compose UI. So it's a set of widgets. But effectively, our compiler and our runtime only cares about emitting a tree of nodes. And a UI happens to be a tree of nodes. But you could apply the reactive concepts to pretty much anything that's tree-based. So, like a very dumb example, but you could use it to generate XML documents or whatever else you can imagine that has a tree-like structure. Mm-hmm. And I would be very interested to see, if not ourselves, the community, try to investigate in what areas this programming model could be useful to help applications be easier to write and more correct, but just applying the reactive principles in other domains.
That is some fascinating thought to play with. Romain, this is fantastic stuff, and I always walk away from these things going, well, here's a technology now I want to look at, and I don't get my time to look into Android tech, but it really does intrigue me to see more declarative UI being built up, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how Compose continues to grow. I really want to thank you for being on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And Jen, that was some really great information, especially with your experience and what you've been going through on that as well.
Thank you.
But that's going to wrap things up for this 9th episode of Season 9. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with Mark Dalrymple. He was on about 2 seasons ago, and Mark's always a treat because you never quite know what we're going to talk about. It could be anything from how to solve problems to just pulling out 30-year-old computer textbooks and having fun being old. But that wraps things up for this episode. We thank again Triple Byte. That's Byte, B-Y-T-E, for sponsoring this episode. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. Until then, we go back to the Emerald Castle. Ray, back to you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for listening to the RayWenderlich.com podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to leave a rating on iTunes. See you next time.